This podcast is part of the Batman Universe Podcast Network, hosted by the BatmanUniverse.net. Check out everything related to Batman and the entire Bat family at the BatmanUniverse.net, including news and original content related to comics, movies, television, merchandise, video games, and more. Also, check out some of the other unique podcasts that TBU has to offer. Consider supporting this podcast by becoming a patron on Patreon. Even $1 can go a long way in supporting this content that you enjoy. Look for a link over at the BatmanUniverse.net to offer your support now. And now, on with the show.
Denny, thank you so much for doing this. And it's funny because my last name is O'Neil also, and I can't tell you how many times I've been in a comic book store signing up for something or paying with my credit card, and I was asked, are you Denny O'Neil's nephew, or are you related to Denny O'Neil? And I always have to say, no, sorry. But I wanted to ask about Robin. I know I've seen you on some interviews take some flack for the 1-900 Kill Jason Todd thing, but that's what got me into comics. That got me into a comic book store. It got me to buy my first comic, and I've been buying it ever since. So for me, it's the greatest thing you ever did. I wanted to know, after Jason Todd was killed and the decision to bring Robin back, but do a new Robin, Tim Drake, and make him very different from Jason Todd. When was the thought process of how Tim would be different, and did that develop over time, or was there a clear game plan? We're going to make Tim a lot different than Jason Todd.
Well, it was pretty much ad-libbed. Jeanette Kahn and I were sitting in a great big old mansion in the mountains about 20 miles from here. We'd had an editorial retreat, which is a valuable tool for an editor. Jeanette was, I think that was the only time she ever came along on a Batman retreat. But what you do, since it's now very important to the genre that continuity be straight and names and places and all those little details be consistent, that becomes a storytelling tool. I kind of resisted it at first, and one of the real great old-timers lost his job because he refused to do it. He said, I don't care if Batman and Sergeant Rock could not be in the same place at the same time. It's a hell of a story. So he got fired, and the guy who fired him was very regretful. But that had become part of what we do. The way I usually did it was, get the writers and a couple of the artists who were involved in the storytelling together. We went usually to Tarrytown, which is just across the river from where I'm sitting. And for 3 days, we sat, and with Jordan Gorfinkel taking notes on my laptop, worked out the story beats for the next 6 months. My assistants wanted us to work out every single panel, which is, by the way, the way that comic books were plotted before us guys came along. Julie Schwartz, if he was going to do a Hawkman, say, he'd plan on spending the day doing that. I would go nuts if I had to sit in one place for 8 hours. And it was better for Julie. Plotting with Steve or Roy or me was no more than an hour. So it gave Julie a lot of time that he didn't have otherwise. And he go, how did I get into that by-way?
Well, we're talking about Tim Drake and how the characterization came, and you were on a editor's retreat with Jeanette Kahn discussing.
Yeah, and one of us, I don't know if it was Jeanette or me, it doesn't really make any difference, had this idea all of a sudden.
It could have been Bob Kane. Bob Kane might have that. Yeah.
This kind of ethereal, transparent thing up in the middle of the room.
You don't like And welcome to episode 115. This show is brought to you by the BatmanUniverse.net, your home for all things Batman and Robin, whom is celebrating 80 years this year. We're also associated with Batman on Films Podcast Network at BatmanPodcastNetwork.com. So between the BatmanUniverse.net and BatmanPodcastNetwork.com, you can find us. You can get a hold of us on Facebook at Facebook.com/EveryoneLovesTheDrake. We are on Twitter at ELTD Podcast. We have an Instagram page as well. You can email into the show at RobinELTDPodcast@Yahoo.com, and also have a newly launched Blogspot page. So to give a little bit of extra context and more show notes and pictures and different things about Tim Drake, and it also ties into Young Justice. So I'm calling it the ELTD Network. You can find us over there at everyonelovesthedrake.blogspot.com. So again, some more resources for you for the podcast, and there'll be some more essays and some more reviews and different things all about Tim Drake that we don't necessarily get to do over at the Batman Universe that's hosting the show, but the links for the show will take you directly to the BatmanUniverse.net. So definitely check that out. everyonelovesthedrake.blogspot.com. So this show is more of a somber show, but also a celebratory show. We're going to be talking about the passing of Denny O'Neil, who was born May 3rd, 1939 in St. Louis, Missouri, and passed away on June 11th, 2020. So not more than about 3 days ago from the time of this recording. So I wanted to read a couple little portions of some things that I have here before we get into the body of the show. And this first thing is just the biography section from the newly released Batman, the 1989 movie adaptation. It has a little bibliography in the back for Denny O'Neil. And I liked this one of all the ones that I've read recently. Dennis O'Neil began his career as a comic book writer in 1965 at Charlton, when then editor Dick Giordano assisted him on several features. When Giordano moved to DC, O'Neil soon followed. At DC, O'Neil sculpted several stories for Giordano and Julius Schwartz, quickly becoming one of the most respected writers in comics. O'Neil then earned reputation for being able to revamp such characters as Superman, Green Lantern, Captain Marvel, and Batman, who Denny O'Neil helped with Neil Adams and Giordano brought back to his roots as a dark, mysterious, gothic Avenger. Besides being the most important Batman writer of the 1970s, O'Neil served as both editor for Marvel and DC. After his long tenure with group editor of the Batman titles, he then retired to write full-time. And the other segment I would like to read is from Batman Lonely Place of Dying's foreword, also written by Denny O'Neil. If you can check this thing out, it's actually, he writes a very fantastic piece just about Robin's history as a whole, and I won't read the whole entire thing. It's about 3 pages long, and I'm just going to read the last couple paragraphs in this, which I think is also very fitting for this as well, since this is Robin, Everyone Loves the Drake. The paragraph starts as, "We had promised to abide by the telephone pole, and we would, but within a few days it became apparent that we'd begun growing another Robin. We'd forgotten that Batman exists outside the pages of our comics. Is not the exclusive property of DC Comics editorial staff, because he is both popular and impressionable. Hundreds of others have legitimate interest in him, not the least of whom who are our readers, who for one reason or another had missed the voting. Our media may have kept him alive, but others have added immeasurably to his success. When we began hearing from others, the consensus was that Batman without a Robin wasn't quite a Batman. I was surprised, nor did I disagree particularly. So our problem became how to create Robin 3 without generating the hostility that plagued poor Jason. Dick was the answer. If we ever thought that the readers felt that Jason somehow usurped Dick's place, then we should link the new Robin to Dick. Give Robin 3 his predecessor's stamp of approval. One writer had almost done all of Dick Grayson's material DC had ever published for a decade, Marv Wolfman, co-creator with George Perez of the new Teen Titans. That made Marv the first and really the only choice to undertake the task of giving Batman a new partner. And if we were using Marv, why not have some of the stories happen in the pages of the new Teen Titans, which he was already writing, and thus be able to take advantage of the very considerable talents of Marv's collaborator on the Teen Titans, George Perez. George volunteered to co-plot the story with Marv, to do the layouts for the Titans episodes, and editor Mike Carlin enlisted Tom Grummett and Bob McLeod to complete George's graphic work. As I asked the regular Batman artist Jim Aparo and Mike DiCarlo to handle the Batman issues, finally we chose the name for Robin 3, Tim Drake, and after a couple of editorial conferences, 6 gifted gentlemen retired to do what they do best. The result, seemingly worthy to be collected between the on-set covers to be read as a graphic novel. We decided to do that, and you're holding the result. I hope you enjoy it, but please don't think that this is the end for the Robin 3 saga. Dick Grayson lasted 50 years after all, and Tim Drake does have his blessing. Denny O'Neil, April 1990. And now, welcome to the show.
The sun just touched the morning. From dreams I awake, drifting in the haze I see the light on your face. The sun is rising still, with no hue of the afternoon. The wind whispers on my face. You're the only one. Do you know who I Ask yourself and tell me what you know about me. Now don't be afraid to look at me and see the man who I am. Underneath the silent sky I wait in this fortress from the sun. My faith follows close to me. It wants for me to know. Spirit flowing in my mind is alive with your glow. The quiet sounds of loneliness. Without you I'd be lost. Do you know who I Ask yourself, well then tell me who I
When you were listening to this podcast, Denny had passed away about a week ago, and we've got Terence on the show. How are you doing today, Terence?
Yeah, doing pretty good. Kind of a sad reason to get together to record, but it's kind of fun to reminisce all the great things about Denny O'Neil's life and our interaction with him. As brief as it was pretty darn cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've always thought of Denny O'Neil as our Stan Lee in a way. Like when you were reading Marvel Comics, you always saw Stan Lee's name somewhere on it in the 80s and early part of the 90s and stuff. And, you know, he was the voice of the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. DC didn't have properties like that where Denny was doing voiceover work, but I felt like any book that you were reading in that 80s, 90s time frame, and 70s as well, and, you know, as far back as his career goes, he was on like DVD, or actually DVD releases. I'm getting way ahead of myself. VHS releases. I remember buying, you know, the VHS for Batman 89 and like some behind the scenes type stuff. There's Denny O'Neil, and his name was plastered all over the comics that we were reading at the time. And I think we probably said it a million times on the show. For the three of us, 89 was really kind of that big gateway of we either were just reading comics, you know, a year or so before 89 or right after the movie came out. And one of the first things I bought, and I have both versions of it in my hand right now, is Batman, the 1989 movie adaptation. And I thought this thing was, I remember going into just like a little drugstore and didn't know that this existed, and I wasn't really reading like Starlog or Comic Scene or Wizard or anything like that to know this was out. But like we've said before, there was just Batman stuff everywhere. So I think I fully expected to walk into the, little drugstore finding Batman something. And there was this, movie adaptation. And I could see that the, writer is, says Denny O'Neil with Jerry Ordway and Steve Olaf, if I'm saying that name right. So I was like, oh, I think I remember that name. And I was just really impressed by the writing of the book. And then, there are some scenes that are a little different. Then a year ago, they came out with the deluxe hardcover edition of this. So that was really my first, awareness of oh, I know that name. I've seen that before. And then every book I would read after or before this came out, I was like, oh, there's Denny O'Neil as a writer. Now he's the editor. So what were some of your early influences where you're like, oh, Denny O'Neil, I know that name?
Yeah, so I think the very first thing I read as a comic collector was written by Denny O'Neil, because I've said this many times on the podcast. The very first book I ever bought was the original first printing trade paperback of A Death in the Family, literally just days or weeks after the last issue had come out, because Batman 429 was the last issue in that book, and 430 was my next book that was still on the shelf when I went to the store to say, hey, I'm addicted now. I need more. And it was there. And if you open that first trade paperback, and it's packed away, so I couldn't really grab it. There's an introduction. Do you think you have it? There's an introduction, right? And it's this introduction that I think is written by Denny O'Neil. Because I remember when I was in 8th grade or so at the time, or 9th grade, and I opened it up, and I'm like, oh, there's reading. There's paragraphs and words. So little did I know you could just skip that. I was just read page 1, next page. And the author for that is attributed, it's some name, and he's University of Gotham City or something like that, or Gotham City Historical Site. Because under Denny O'Neil's Wikipedia, it has his pseudonyms as Sergius O'Shaughnessy, which is funny because my last name's O'Neil and my mom's maiden name was Shaughnessy, and Jim Dennis. But did you just email me the guy's name?
Oh, no, sorry. It's in your text message.
Oh, text message.
Yeah.
All right. So it's attributed to, where is it? Okay, yeah. Socrates R. Roeder, Professor Emeritus of 20th Century History, Gotham University. So I started reading this, and I remember, it mentioned something, I think I thought Robin's name was Robin. I don't think I even knew. On the Super Friends cartoon, which I watched like crazy as a kid, I don't think they've gotten to his backstory that much. And I don't remember, on 66, that much about the Flying Graysons and Dick Grayson as much or so. And I hadn't even read or thought about Batman in years and years at this point. So I remember, reading something in this and asking my mom, was the Robin on Batman Dick Grayson? And she's like, I have no idea. I remember her saying that, how would I know? And then I realized, oh wait, this is a second Robin. This is Jason wait, that it wasn't Bruce Wayne and Jason Todd. They didn't kill the real Robin. They just killed this other guy who was Robin. So I remember having that feeling in this, and then getting to the end and being really confused. I'm like, is there really a Gotham City, or is there a Gotham University? And I don't think I had any idea Socrates, or as Bill and Ted like to call him, Socrates.
I kept wanting to say, I know that's wrong.
Socrates. I don't even know. I don't think I knew who he was or anything like that. So my point of all this rambling is I believe that Dr. Socrates S. Roeder, which I wonder if we rearrange these, it'll spell something or something like that. I feel like it's Denny O'Neil, and that was Denny O'Neil. I think he was the editor at the time. But slowly, as I started to read comics, Stan Lee had his From the Soapbox in Marvel Comics. Denny O'Neil had a little piece in DC Comics, just the Batman titles, which at that time was just Batman and Detective, but it would say From the Den. And it was just a little it could have been about anything and everything. And that's kind of where I started to read and figure out, who is this guy? Who's this guy? And then it wasn't too shortly after the whole Batman 89 and all that, is when they came out with the Legends of the Dark Knight, which was such a huge deal of a new number one, which now there's like a number one every 5 minutes, but
Right.
a new number one, and they were pumping it up as the first original Batman series since 1939. That was a big thing. It was just the first one since 1939, and it was going to have this 5-issue arc to start off called Venom, and it was written by Dennis O'Neil, and that was when I was like making this connection of like, oh yeah, okay, I know that guy, and oh yeah, this must be important if he's the one doing it. And then I don't know how, but somehow, some way, I found out about his Green Lantern, Green Arrow run, and how just revolutionary it was, and I got a very like 80s version of that. It was a trade paperback of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow run, and was really blown away by it, even though that was from, I'd have to look at the date. It may have been the 70s, but it was really has like a 1960s feel to it. But yet at the same point, it was dealing with a lot of stuff that you just didn't see in the other comics, and it's pretty remarkable to show what a revolutionary and a visionary Denny O'Neil was in his writing, because you could swear that like some of this stuff was just ripped out of the headlines today in 2020 with the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement and everything going on. And there's a pretty remarkable panel. I wanted to read it here for Denny O'Neil. People have probably seen it a million times, but it's Neil Adams' art. And Neil Adams, has said in interviews he went to great lengths to make African Americans look natural and how they looked in real life. Because if you look at comics before Neil Adams, the inking and the coloring and the renditions were just not, what people look like in real life. And there's an older African American gentleman talking to Hal Jordan, Green Lantern. He says to Hal Jordan, and these are Denny O'Neil's words, but I don't know if anybody knows, Denny O'Neil was a Buddhist and child of the 60s, so to speak. He says, I've been reading about you, how you work for the Blueskins, and how on a planet someplace you helped out the Orange Skins, and you done considerable for the Purple Skins, only they're skins you never bothered with, the Black Skins. I want to know how come. Answer me that, Mr. Green Lantern. And it's pretty remarkable seeing like heroes and seeing the super friends, and the heroes are always have their chest puffs out and their arms to the side, but here like Neil Adams' art's amazing, and Hal Jordan just hangs his head and he says like, I can't, but then he says something here that I think a lot of people feel like, and it says Denny's narration says, in the time it takes to draw a single breath, the span of a heartbeat, a man looks into his own soul and his life changes. And Hal Jordan says, okay, maybe I've been a dummy, so tell me, how do I help? And then the gentleman says to him, I'm no advice committee. If you want to bad enough, you'll find a way. And I think there's a lot of people right now who actually feel like Hal Jordan feels like, okay, tell me, what can I do? How can I help? How can I make things better and do better? And considering that, Hal Jordan is an intergalactic space police officer and everything going on with the police now and everything, it's a pretty remarkable read, and it's definitely decades ahead of where he was. Did you read that Green Arrow, Green Lantern series at some point?
Yeah, it's been quite a while. It's probably been 10 or 15 years ago since I have read it. And I think I actually picked it up from a library. It wasn't something that I felt like, I need to add this to my collection. But after reading it, I'm like, maybe I ought to track down a trade paperback or something like that. But yeah, I really liked it. And I was looking while you were talking there, and Denny O'Neil's arc begins with issue 76 in 1970, and it ends with issue 122 in 1979. So they had a long span right there for the the long traveling heroes, as one of the banners would say. But yeah, it's a fascinating run, and like you said, you could, with everything that's going on now, like you said, you could plop the social commentary right into this, and these two characters would work very well. And reading some of that, if like you were kind of jogging my memory, it's like that a lot of stuff is still sadly going on today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely pretty amazing. His work was so vast. Like he wrote the Superman Muhammad Ali story. That's like a
Right.
classic that'll go around forever. I feel like 500 years from now, when people are looking back at American comics of the 20th century, Action Comics #1 will come up, and Detective #27, and then I think Green Arrow, Green Lantern will be. I keep saying it backwards. Sorry. Green Lantern, Green Arrow, the Greens will be one that'll come up and be like, look, here's a moment where mainstream comics started to tackle social issues like racism, prejudice, police brutality. I think there's an issue there where they deal with Native American rights. There's an issue there where Speedy is addicted to heroin and dealing with the drug addiction. So, yeah, it's pretty amazing.
And I was talking about, reading forwards and not going, oh, I don't know, I'm not supposed to be reading this. This isn't part of the story. One thing I did that with was A Lonely Place of Dying. And Denny writes the intro to the trade. I'm not going to read it here. Maybe I'll put it in post or something like that. But just about the creating of who Robin is and what this new Tim Drake character was going to become, or their hopefulness. Wordy is the wrong thing. Like, you could look at stuff and go, oh my gosh, there's so much to read here, and he just rambles on forever. It's not like that at all. Like, the 2 or 3 pages that this intro for Lonely Place and then Death in the Family, it's its own piece. Like, I would have spent cover price on that alone. So that's something I always really appreciated in Denny's writing, that I never felt like he took this as like, okay, these are just comic books. He took them as serious as we read them. So the more serious he made all these characters sound and the way they talked, you're like, well, it sounds like dialect that you would hear people talk. And he had different, Gone was the cookie cutter formula of the 50s and 40s and 60s. Like, all right, we're just throwing this stuff out there. And, for kids to read, they came in the Silver Age, and we're like, no, we want to treat these characters with respect and reverence, and that's going to transcend to our readers. And, here we are, some 50 years later from when he started writing to the huge, massive empire that, for work he did with DC and Marvel, is today. And something I was saying at the top of the show, getting, Blu-rays and DVDs, anytime there was a VHS or a DVD or whatever, and there was interviews from creators, Denny was always in those. So I can remember the first time I saw a picture of him, other than his little cartoon doodle that he would do or something like that, you start putting a name with a face and go, oh, that's Denny O'Neil, and seeing him on the, the red carpet for Batman '89 or Batman Forever. Are there stories that you have that you're like, oh man, this is really good, even if it was just an edited book, or if you're like, this is a really good Denny O'Neil story, like, where would you point somebody to, something that means something to you?
Well, it's kind of funny because if somebody's really good at something for a long period of time, they'll say, oh, he wrote the book on it. Like, oh, this guy wrote the book on it. Well, Denny O'Neil literally wrote the book on writing comics. It's called the DC Comics Guide to Writing Comics, and it's written by Denny O'Neil, and my library had it, and I took it out and read it, and it's pretty fascinating, and it's where I learned all about the 3-act structure of what's, most every movie and comic and thing you'll read in every Marvel movie is just like classic 3-act structure. The thing that really stands out for me for Denny O'Neil, and it's funny because we were lucky enough to interview Chuck Dixon, and he talked about how this was so classic Denny O'Neil, and it stood out to me. And even just like separate, and then it's like, oh yeah, this is what Denny O'Neil did, was the ending for the whole Nightfall, Night Quest, Knights, everything saga, which was the big final battle between Bruce and Jean-Paul Valley, and how it ended with, Batman kind of using his brain to temporarily blind Jean-Paul and subdue him, but not beat him or kill him. And then Batman kind of at the end kind of forgives him and lets him go on his way to, you're forgiven, now sin no more, like do better, and I don't know if you remember that, but when I think Ryan asked a question to Chuck Dixon, and Chuck was like, that's such a Denny ending. That was such a Denny story. And so that always stood out to me as just like a really brilliant way to end that whole Nightfall, Night Quest saga.
I don't want to repeat, so I'm going to have a different answer. I mean, I liked that as well. I think Chuck had even said if he was doing it, it would have been this knockdown, drag out fight in the Batcave. They would have destroyed half the cave and, winner take all type of thing. But I think that does do the exact opposite of what Nightfall started. Like, well, why Batman doesn't kill? And then you got this Batman that's, going around almost murdering people in Jean Paul. And then you bring it back to show this is who Batman is. This is why Bruce Wayne remains Batman. But one that I didn't read because I was way too young at the time. I'm trying to grab it on my spinner rack real quick. They started doing reprints of some of these issues, but it is Batman 232. So it's the one where it's when I decide Robin dies, he dies. It's got like this green cover with Ra's al Ghul with his hands sticking out. Like you see posters of this, and you could find like wood plaques at Hobby Lobby or Walmart to hang on your wall. But it's got a gun coming off into just out of frame, shooting Robin basically in the stomach. This is the tale will haunt you forever, the daughter of the demon. So this giant oversized Treasury edition I have has that story in the creation of Ra's al Ghul, and that's one of those characters that Denny is known for with Talia and Raz, and I've always been really fascinated. And like you said, with Denny being a Buddhist, he kind of works some of that stuff and the more mythical side of that in Ra's al Ghul, and then that gets translated into Batman and Batman the Animated Series episode, that idea of that story. So that was one I always really liked before I knew, just watching the animated series, that this was also based off a book, and that book was written by Denny O'Neil. So, it's a book, if you have it, it's really up there in price. So the closest I got was the $3.99 reprint of it, late last year, as they were doing those for the 80th anniversary of Batman. But that's one I always really liked. Did you read the basically introduction of Ra's al Ghul's story ever?
I feel like I did, but a really long time ago. I don't really remember it. Whenever I think of like that era of comics and Ra's al Ghul, I always picture like Batman with his blue cowl on and no shirt and just tons of chest hair all over. So I don't know if that was like, Bride of the Demon or Child of the Demon or one of those things, Birth of the Demon. I don't know, but I kind of think you mentioned Tim Drake. I know it's kind of hard to figure out who created Tim Drake because there are so many kind of like hands in it. I know, Marv Wolfman was the writer. In Wikipedia, it says Pat Broderick, but he did the art for year 3, which Tim Drake is just like a kid at the circus there. I don't know if he really created it. I know Neil Adams did a lot of the designs. I always think Norm Brayfogle, gets has that first image of Meet the New Robin kind of thing. But Denny O'Neil, so Tim Drake's got a lot of fathers, but it seems like Denny O'Neil feels like his grandfather. Like he was the old man overseeing, I say old man, he was probably younger than us at the time it was going on. or just about. He was probably in his 50s probably when Tim Drake came out. He was 81. And that was 30 years ago, so math-wise, he was 50, which at the time when I was in high school seemed like, oh, God, he's ancient. And I'm like, that's not that old.
Right.
But, yeah, I feel like he's Tim Drake's grandpa. And I've said this 1,000 times. When we got to interview Denny O'Neil, it was like listening to your grandfather or your uncle, and he was telling us these stories that I had heard 1,000 times. I heard on those DVD commentaries and I heard on Fat Man on Batman, but it was just so cool to like hear it again and hear it live from him. So I don't know if you wanted to go to when we interviewed him just yet, but
so the interview that we keep talking about that you're like, wow, where's that Denny O'Neil interview? And I know I got a couple messages that were saying, hey, you guys were talking about this Denny O'Neil interview. I can't find it in your podcast feed. And I was like, well, you're not going to because we've never released it. So long story short, which I think we've said this before, Ryan initially had set this up and wanted to dovetail into his Azrael podcast. that he's been working on this whole entire time, but kind of waiting till they get through Nightfall and get to Azrael, because we were asking Azrael questions and then Robin questions and overall Batman questions. So we were going to split it up between 3 podcasts, being our show, the Azrael show, and then some movie stuff over on Batman on Film. And like with everything in life, sometimes, the best laid plans, well, they kind of fell through the cracks. So I've been joking for a while, like, man, if we wait too much longer, Denny's going to be gone. And sadly, that's what happened. So I believe Ryan is hurriedly trying to get all that up, but we did have this interview 3 years ago, and I've not really listened to it other than I think I put a couple little blurbs after Denny's wife had passed away, because he said some really sweet things about her there, and I thought, oh, that'd be really, really sweet to kind of honor the memory of his wife. So I pulled that little chunk out and put it in an episode. But Terrence, you said you got a chance to go back and listen to the episode, and hopefully you guys will hear it pretty soon. But you had some little factoids about some things I'd forgotten about during the interview. And just one last thing, it did make me feel like I was sitting listening to my grandfather tell stories I've heard 100 times, but now he's saying them to me. So that was pretty cool. Like, I think it happened twice, talking to Chuck Dixon, going, oh my gosh, I can't believe we talked to Chuck Dixon. And then going, I can't believe I'm talking to Denny O'Neil. Like, that interview really blew me away, that I was getting a chance to ask him a question, and it might take him an hour to answer that one question, but he could have told me how Velcro was made, and I'd have been like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So what about Batman did you like?
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. So I'm going to say this because our good buddy of the show, Rich. Hey, Rich, how's it going?
Hey, what's up, buddy?
I sent Rich the link to the digital files. They're just the raw, unedited interview. Mm-hmm. It's broken up into a couple of different sections. And I think Rich started listening to it in the middle section, and I was listening to the beginning. So he was like texting through Facebook a couple things like, oh, this is funny. I'm like, wait, we're on different parts here. It was kind of funny because we were like getting all excited, like, and we hadn't really interviewed anybody before. Did we do?
We did
Chuck Dixon first, yeah.
Yeah, so he was like, that was episode 51, and I think it was pretty shortly after, because I'm looking at the file here. So the file that I have, this was, wow, May 18th, 2017 was when that was recorded. And the Chuck Dixon interview was episode 51. Just to give you a little perspective of where that is. That file timestamp is, so that was back in 15. So that was May 3rd, 2015. So,
yeah, and on the recording, we say it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I believe I had things to do that I canceled, and my wife helped out. I think my wife took off work so she could drive the kids after school or something.
Canceled something.
You said that you took a half day at work. You're like, I took a half day or something like that, So we were like waiting around all day for it. And this is kind of a funny thing. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody, but it was just kind of funny. The first thing Denny O'Neil said to us was like, if we finally got him on Skype, Ryan had to call him, and I'm not really sure how Ryan was doing it, whether he had like tin cans with string, and he was doing something to get Denny O'Neil on the phone, and we were on Skype, and he had bought like Skype credits and stuff. And the first thing Denny O'Neil says is he's hard of hearing, and he can't hear very well, and you've got to like speak up. So I was like, I hope this isn't going to be a problem. And then Ryan asked him a question, and he heard that fine. But then the second, who was the other guy who was on with us? It was somebody from BOF, right?
No, that's Matt Whaley. That would be Ryan's co-host on the Azrael podcast.
The Azrael, okay. Yep. So Matt asked him a question, and he asks him something about reinventing Batman in the 70s with Neil Adam. I guess Batman in the 70s. And Denny O'Neil goes, huh? Batman facilities? and I'm like, oh no, he's not going to hear us. But I don't know why. He said the question, and then from that point on, it was never a problem with his hearing. Right. But I just remember that moment of panic of like, he's not going to be able to hear what we're saying. Oh no. And I told you this before we started. Ryan asks him the first question at 4 minutes and 25 seconds. And the reason why is because Rob did the whole intro to the Drake. And I remember saying, Rob, don't do the whole intro because you're just going to re-record it anyway. And don't make Denny O'Neil sit there for it. And Rob's like, hello, welcome to Everybody Loves Drake. And I'm like, oh, no. And then you're like, you're going to everybody. You're like, hey, my good buddy, Terence O'Neil, how you doing? I'm like, fine, good, go on. Like, I just had, it was the shortest answer I've ever given you ever in the history of the podcast. I'm like, good, just get to why we're here. And then Ryan says, to Denny O'Neil, we're going to keep it to Batman. We'll stick to Batman. And then he asked him a question. I don't even remember what the first question was. Something about can Batman work in different interpretations or something like that. And Denny O'Neil started talking at 4:25 and didn't stop answering the question to 31 minutes and 18 seconds into the recording. And he talked about everything other than basically what Ryan asked him. Everything he said was golden. Like, I was just sitting there like, oh my God, I can't believe this here. And he even got in some jabs. Do you remember when he said he referred to Batman's creator, Bill Finger? Like, do you remember that? Yeah. Which I feel like Bob Kane's the pendulum swung too far on Bob Kane. I feel a little bad for Bob Kane. Like, all of a sudden, Bob Kane is like the worst villain ever. Like, he's not. Like, this is a whole other podcast for it. But look how DC and the industry, like, screwed over so many creators, like, Siegel and Schuster and stuff. Like, if you were Bob Kane, you had a fight and tooth and nail for every little thing because they were going to run you over like they did so many other creators. But, he had some unkind words for Bob Kane. I remember he compared Bob Kane to Donald Trump and said he reminds me of Donald Trump. He talked about how Bob Kane had lambasted his assistant because he forgot to put created by Bob Kane in one comic book. Talked about how calling up Bill Finger's granddaughter, so happy that Bill Finger's name was on the Batman v Superman intro movie and stuff, which he said that Stan Lee was one of two brilliant editors he had worked for. And I'll throw this back to you, Rob. The thing, like, growing up as a kid, I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s and 90s. Our grandparents' generation, which is where Denny O'Neil and Stan Lee came from, our grandparents did not understand comics. They didn't like comics. They thought it was like kid stuff. You never saw anyone from that generation say, oh, I love comics. Now, our parents' generation, they still had those people like, what are you wasting your time with this kid stuff? But there were definitely people in our parents' generation who were like, oh yeah, I loved Superman in the 50s. I loved, Adam West Batman. I loved, Christopher Reeve Superman in the 80s. I used to read comics. And now our generation and the generations that come, there's so many. But, Denny O'Neil and Stan Lee were like a rarity for that grandparent generation to have liked comics and champion comics. Did you feel the same way, that he was sort of like the grandpa of Batman, kind of?
Yeah, I did. And there was just something that I was like, if this guy likes it, and I don't mean anything bad by saying it, but thinking in my young mind, if this old guy is telling me that Batman's cool and he cares about this that much, Batman must really be cool. Or this guy wouldn't be telling me. It's not like you'd have some people like, dude, this is just a job. I really don't like moving refrigerators and washers. This is just what pays the bills. And that might have started it for him. But by the time our generation is coming along, you could hear the passion in it. So I was just like, yeah.
But his answers were so amazing, because it's funny, after like 31 minutes, he's like, you guys got a question for me? And it's like, there's no, I don't know how you and Ryan are editing this, because there's not a lot of like pauses to, like edit, and it goes all over the place. Like, but the thing that struck me is everything he talked about and everything he said, you could tell he was a writer first. Like, it was all from a writer's perspective, or like spun like the way a writer would tell. Like, everyone else would be like, yeah, I was in a car accident in Pennsylvania. He's like, I love Pennsylvania in the wintertime, but when the blizzard's on the outside and I'm on the inside, but then we had to drive through Pennsylvania and my eyes were getting heavy and my wife said she couldn't drive, and I knew it. Like, it's just so like I'm reading a novel, how he's telling the story, how he was in this car accident in Pennsylvania, and he approached it, so much from that writer's perspective of things, which I thought was really cool. And it's kind of funny in the beginning. You can hear us giggling a lot. Like he'll say something, and we're like a couple of schoolgirls, like we're talking to the captain of the football team. It's really funny. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember just coming away from the interview that even if all of our questions weren't answered, I didn't care. Like you said, the stories that he was telling were just enough for the quote unquote price of admission. So that Ryan was able to put that together, because I even remember the text, him saying, "Hey, I'm finalizing the idea or the details, but I think I've lined up an interview with Denny O'Neil." And I was like, pulling my leg. Like,
yeah,
I didn't necessarily. Not that I didn't believe it, but I was like, okay, where's the punchline? He's like, no, seriously, this is going to happen. So I remember thinking, like, I'm working, it's going to be, I can't remember exactly what part of the day it was or what part of the week. And I'm just like, I'm working. He's like, well, we really can't, make him adjust the schedule. We've got to go to where he is. And I remember talking to my wife. I'm like, I can't not do this,
Yeah.
Even if it's just I'm going to ask one question and that's it. I don't even care if I get to ask anything. I just want to be able to hear him talk. If it was just he and Ryan, it's like, okay, you guys get to listen, but you can't say anything. I would have been like, okay, I'll mute my mic. I'll just listen and I'll text you questions or something like that. So that was pretty cool to do, to just hear him. Like you said, stories that he's told before, probably a million times in all those interviews and everything we've heard, but that he was talking to us, I think was really kind of special and really cool. And did you have any other stories or issues that you liked, or just any other thoughts about Denny that you had?
I don't know. I just feel really lucky to have gotten to have a personal connection by sitting in my room here and listening to him on a Skype call live for about 2 hours or so, and just it's pretty monumental, his work in the comics and the comic book industry, especially the comics that I loved so much, those late 80s, mid 90s Batman Family, Robin, Nightwing, Detective, Shadow the Bat series. So it's just was a pretty awesome experience, and it was really, really sweet in the interview and in other interviews that I've heard him talk about how much he loved his wife and how they met when they were kids, and how then they were apart for 20 years, and he was married and had kids, and she was married and had kids, and then they met back together, and their kids became friends, and they had this just second chance love affair. And so when I heard that he had passed away, it was kind of bittersweet and sad that he was gone, but hopefully he's reunited in a better place with his wife somewhere, and they can be together forever. And so that was my kind of final thought on it.
Yeah, and it's just one of those that it's been a name that has just been in all of the books. I mean, all the books that we're going to talk about on this show, Denny's name is in it throughout. And one of the 80th anniversary specials, a book that Terence and Ryan and I were planning on talking about, that somebody picked up, that maybe at some point the three of us will still talk about, was the Detention Comics issue that was drawn by Norm Breyfogle and written by Denny O'Neil. That was a Tim Drake Robin led story. So that was the only one of its kind that he wrote a single solo Tim Drake story, and it fit right in with everything that was going on at the time. But just the body of work, as we've been talking, I've just been scrolling through the Wikipedia page, and just the list of his credentials and credits, starting at Charlton Comics, and then the DC section is huge. Marvel, the series of graphic novels that he's done. His novels, he ended up retiring from the chief editor for DC, and then went into just writing novels. So there's a whole list of those, fiction and nonfiction, and then essay works that he's done. Television, the Demon's Quest episode for Batman the Animated Series was written by him and co-written by Lee Wein. So there's just all kinds of stuff that is, like, his legacy is going to continue on for a millennia or better, and rightfully so. This was just an episode we wanted to be able to put together and just share some thoughts. We've kind of said before, if you have the Batman Mount Rushmore, what faces are going to be on there? This is one of the top faces that's going to be on that Mount Rushmore Batman for ages to come, and is one that people can probably get close to, but I don't think anybody's really going to get to that level that Denny O'Neil had, especially once he became like editor. There was this real cohesiveness with the Bat titles in the late 80s and early 90s that just had this huge universe that was going on that is part of why this show exists in the first place, is due to Denny O'Neil's work. So,
although in the Batman universe, everything somehow, it's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever. It's like, I think everyone in the Batman universe is 6 degrees separation from Denny O'Neil. Probably most is just 1 degree. But Clinton from, Clinton Robinson from the Coffee and Comics podcast.
Yep.
All right. That is our episode 114, where you guys reviewed Showcase 93.
Yes.
How the heck do you not like the red Nightwing New 52 outfit? That is a cool looking costume. It looks good in action figures. It looks good as a pop hero. I have a metallic one in Pop Hero. It looked good on Chris O'Donnell in Batman and Robin. One of the few good things, about that movie. Like, I never heard anybody criticize, the Nightwing costume in that outfit. I don't know what. Oh man, I don't know what he was talking about here. Clinton, put that coffee down. This is crazy.
He's had too much coffee. I loved it, and I like the blue. Don't get me wrong, but there was something about the red that directly ties into his time as Robin. I think it's very fitting that all of the former Robins would have something red on it, except the brown bomber.
And one other thing I wanted to add before we sign off. 12 days ago, as of this recording, on June 2nd, we got a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
Ooh.
So I wanted to just take a second and say thank you to LLPDV, and his what he wrote for us was everyone, or I should say maybe she, I don't know, I don't want to assume. We've gotten in trouble with that before with people where we assumed. But LLPVV writes, everyone loves Rob Myers! ! This show, and I'm not even making this up, Rob, this is true. It says, this show is just a wonderful love letter to the greatest sidekick in history. The Boy Wonder himself could not have done a better job honoring his own legacy. Rob and the crew show their passion with every show. I cannot wait to listen to the next episode. Just a fantastic show. So thank you for that review.
Well, like Seinfeld, we're going out on a high note. That's the show.
Yep.
So this is where we'll end the show, and thank you, Denny, for all the wonderful, wonderful many years of comics, and that we are going to still continue to enjoy on this show. So tune in a couple weeks for our next installment, getting back to the 90s era of Tim Drake, and then a future episode for the 80th anniversary of Robin. On the behalf of Terence, this is Rob, and rest in peace, Denny O'Neil. You've been listening to the BatmanUniverse.net. More importantly, you've been listening to Robin. Everyone loves a Drake. Take care. Bye. Thanks for listening to Robin. Everyone loves the Drake podcast. This has been brought to you by the BatmanUniverse.net. Tim Drake, Robin, and all Batman-related characters are under copyright of DC Comics. This podcast is solely for entertainment purposes, so no infringement is intended by this show. This show is not a good revenue stream. Actually, there's not a stream at all. All music and sound clips are under copyright by their respected copyright holders. So there should be no need to send the Penguins lawyers after us for ill-gotten gains, because there are none. You can get a hold of the show a few different ways. We are on Twitter at ELTD Podcast. You can also email in at robineltdpodcast@yahoo.com. Our Facebook page can be found at www.facebook.com/everyonelovesdrake. And as always, you can message directly over at the BatmanUniverse.net. So email, tweet, or message us. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll read your comments or responses on the show. The show you're listening to can be found a few different ways through iTunes and Windows Media, also over at our host, TBU. Leave us a review on iTunes if you listen there. It'll help spread the word of the show. Make sure you head over to the BatmanUniverse.net, your home for all things Batman and Robin. Thanks for listening to the show and hearing why everyone loves the Drake. We'll see you in a few weeks. Take care.